Good morning, everyone. Why don't we take our seats? Hey, yeah, please, yeah, go ahead. Good morning and welcome to ESHG 2022. It's wonderful to be back in person after a two-year hiatus. So thank you very much for all of you who are attending on a Saturday morning, no less. And hello to all of you joining from around the world watching the live session. My name is Edward Dove. I'm a lecturer in Health Law and Regulation at the School of Law at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm an SPC member, and this is my last year on the SPC. This is an educational session, and as I think many of you know, educational sessions are not designed for those who are already expert in a particular field, but really to provide a lay of the land, not presuming in any previous knowledge. This is educational session number 6, Genetic Discrimination, Surveying the Ethical Legal Landscape. We have two fantastic speakers. Each will present for about 30 to 45 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. We'll have some Q&A after each of their presentations. So by all means, please do think of questions you want to pose to our presenters. For those of you attending in person, you can use the microphones you see there in the center. And for those of you tuning in virtually, please do type in your questions and comments, and we can then relay them to the presenters. I'd encourage you to put your phones on silent or vibrate if they're not already turned off. Please do not video or audio record the presentations. It's possible to photograph, but please take instruction from the presenters that they might have a restriction on photography as well. I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Jan Joly, who's going to be speaking to us about genetic discrimination, international ethical legal perspectives, and the work of the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. Jan Joly is the Research Director of the Center of Genomics and Policy at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. He is a full professor at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences in the Department of Human Genetics at McGill University. And he's also an associate member of the bioethics unit at McGill University. His research interest lies at the interface of the fields of scientific knowledge, health law, and bioethics. And he is the creator of the first International Genetic Discrimination Observatory in 2018. So I think this is very much a timely topic. Of course, not a new topic, but there have been a lot of developments, I think, that create new issues and make us rethink about old ideas, too, in genetic discrimination. So we're absolutely delighted to start with Professor Joly. Jan, over to you.
Thank you, and please bear with me 2 seconds while I get the technology to work. So I believe you told me...
Just click on your box and it should come up. There we go.
I wasn't clicking hard enough. Here we are. All right. So welcome, everybody. As Ted, and I'd like to thank him to have organized this. As was mentioning, I've created an observatory on genetic discrimination and launched it at the international level a few years ago. And the presentation will focus today on both some basic concept behind genetic discrimination, just to see that we're discussing some of the same issues. Then we'll go to the international level, talk a little bit about the situation, and why I thought it would be relevant to have an international observatory on genetic discrimination, and then we'll talk about some of the recent challenges as well. And I look forward to the question as well after that. I'm sure there'll be some interesting discussion. So let me have a look. This is the plan. So genetic discrimination. What is genetic discrimination? There are many ways to define it. So this is one definition, or actually, sorry, this is really just to remind everybody that, you know, even though we're going to talk about genetic discrimination today, I'm somebody that actually think that a lot of good things are going to come out of genetics, and, you know, we should not forget that sometimes when, you know, ethicists talk about ethical issues and we get into discussing these issues, we tend to forget the other side of the coin, which is that genetics has a lot of potential for modern medicine and for patients everywhere. And I think this should always stay in the back of our mind as we have these discussions on some of these ethical issues. And so this is just a quick reminder that genetics and other omics science are becoming increasingly important in healthcare and disease prevention. And some example of that, we can think about precision medicine, pharmacogenomics. We can think also about the amazing work that genomics has allowed us to do right now to fight the COVID pandemic. So these are just really example, and can think about all the diagnostic tests, etc. So now moving on to genetic discrimination. So genetic discrimination involves treating people differently, negatively, or unfairly profiling individuals relatively to the rest of the population on the basis of actual or presumed genetic characteristics. And we can see this as really a complex concept. I mean, when we look at it from a scientific way, a lot of this makes good sense, but try to think about a policymaker trying to capture this definition in the law, and you can see why I'm saying this is so complex. So for example, when I say I talk about genetic characteristics. So what are genetic characteristics? How do you define them? Are we just talking about purely genetics? Are we considering genomics and other types of omics as well when we're defining genetic discrimination and when we are prohibiting, for example, access to genetic test results in some of our laws? So how broad should we go with that definition? And you see that I've suggested some other concept that could be used. So like I said, genomics, omics, predictive health data, biometric data. And if you look at the various laws that have been adopted around the world to prevent genetic discrimination, you'll see that it often fluctuates from one law to another in what they're actually using. Another big difference in the definitions of genetic discrimination from a legal perspective is that the law will talk about prohibited grounds and sectors, because basically from a legal standpoint, we take the position that discrimination is part of life and it happens all the time. And only specific type of genetic discriminations that are based on prohibited grounds, prohibited justifications are illegal. So for example, the use of genetic information by insurers could be prohibited specifically. So that would be a prohibited ground, would be to use it for insurance purpose or for employment purposes. So all of that to say, first of all, to give you an idea of what genetic discrimination is, but to also tell you it's not a super precise concept and it fluctuates depending on where you pick up the definition. These are just some moral consideration as to why we don't like genetic discrimination, why we don't like to see it from an ethical perspective. We often hear that people have no control over their genetic code, that it conflicts genetic discrimination with the right to autonomy, equity, and dignity. It's also conducive to exclusion and stigmatization. And there are studies to demonstrate that, like many other types of discrimination, it can be a source of anxiety, discomfort, and depression for victims. It's one of the reasons people don't like to participate in genetic research. One of the first things that's going to come up when you ask people, why are you not participating to genetic research, is this concern about their information being used to discriminate them. And even more worrisome, it's also a reason why people, even in the clinical context, will not want to pass a genetic test, even if it's recommended by their doctor. A last point is about the concept of intersectionality, which is really a complicated word to say things pile up in terms of discrimination. Very often, people that are victim of genetic discrimination are already discriminated and vulnerable from other perspectives. So for example, very often, you'll see people that are discriminated because of their ethnic origin being also a victim of genetic discrimination, or people that are discriminated because they have a specific disease being also discriminated because of genetic reasons. So just coming back, when we talk about genetic discrimination, as I mentioned, when we talk about this in law, we say that, again, not all types of discrimination is bad, and that some type of discrimination are not just part of everyday life, but sometimes it can actually be a good thing to be able to classify people, to categorize them according to their genetic. Some of the reasons, and again, this is not necessarily an open ticket to do this, but I think that all of us can agree that genetic information is uniquely identifying individual. I mean, it takes very few SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphism, to single out someone, and that's very useful for forensic and for crime prevention. Most countries around the world have criminal databases where we store DNA from people that have been found guilty of serious crimes. And if it is used in a way that has a robust framework, legal framework, and with ethical consideration, it's a good thing because it can help us prevent crime. Same thing, we can use genetic information to guide treatment. This is what pharmacogenomics is all about. It's about knowing who has better chance to benefit from a specific treatment so that we can prescribe that treatment or less risk to have adverse effect. So in a way, some people might be denied treatment, but it's for a good reason. It's because those treatments are extremely expensive sometimes, and they may have absolutely no chance to benefit them, or they might be risky even for those persons. So these are cases where it is a sort of discrimination. We are categorizing individual, but you know, it is for a purpose that is beneficial for society. So where are we right now when we look around the world in the different studies on genetic discrimination? Well, we see first of all that from a methodological standpoint, it's very difficult to talk about the incidence of genetic discrimination because the studies are very domain-specific, such as genetic discrimination in insurance or genetic discrimination in employment, and most of them suffer from very significant methodological limitations, which really doesn't allow us to talk about the statistical significance or to do meta-analysis, etc. We do know that genetic discrimination has been documented for carriers of monogenic, highly penetrant genetic mutations. So those people in the insurance field, especially life insurance and health insurance as well in the US, there have been issues of genetic discrimination that have been quite well documented. In North America and Europe, as I said, mainly personal insurance for employment. In East Asia, there's been some study also demonstrated that it can extend, and that, for example, when thinking about marriage, genetics can be considered as other status, as other health information. So it can be used in the context of personal relationship to discriminate in Asia as well. While genetic discrimination is generally not widespread, it's very specific to some genetic condition, to some areas. However, the perception and the concerns about genetic discrimination are quite widespread, meaning that people in general that are going to have to undertake genetic tests in the context of research or clinical care are very much aware and worried about this. This is just a quick map that we've done with the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. This shows you a little bit of what we do. This is about all the different policies around the world to prevent genetic discrimination. It's updated in real time. You can see in dark blue are the countries that have adopted actually law to prevent genetic discrimination. In brown are countries that have adopted moratorium. So these are not law, these are agreements between a specific sector and the government often, or sometimes it's between it's a voluntary moratorium, and so the government then is not involved, so it's a little bit less strong in this case. You also have countries in yellow, for example, that have adopted like ethical guidelines or policy on genetic discrimination, so no hard laws, but ethical proclamation against this. Example in the US is just to sort of show you that it's not, 100% protection when I say there are laws. So there are federal laws to prevent genetic discrimination in health insurance, employment, and group insurance. However, the protection from life insurer using genetic information is very limited, and it depends on each state. Those laws are adopted for life insurance at the state level. And outside of genetic testing, there's a lot of uncertainty. So if you're starting to talk about the more recent development in genetics and in omics field, so for example, epigenetic test result, risk prediction model, polygenic risk score, all of this might not be captured by the current US laws. And what's also ironic is even though there are laws to protect people against genetic discrimination, most of the people in the US are actually unaware that these protections are in place. So it's difficult for them to actually seek protection when they're discriminated. And also, if we think of it at the international level, if you're a US citizen and you want to have a job in the UK, for example, and you refuse an employment for genetic reason, it wouldn't be the US law that would apply, right? It would be the UK law, because laws are usually limited to a state, territory, country. They don't really apply at the international level. So the protection is also limited to the country. So if we're talking in an international perspective, there is very little protection. So because existing protection regime vary across countries and region, it's really problematic because we're in a context where we see a globalization of genomics research and care. So these are some of the key reasons that sort of suggested to me that more needed to be done at the international level. Also, the laws that I showed you earlier did not really form a coherent whole, meaning that, if you're doing international research, the protection varies from one country to another very significantly. So there is a need for harmonization there. And there is a need to pass a clear message to people that are involved in genetic research or clinical care. That's not going to change depending on where they're situated. And also, it's important to help countries that are right now developing their genomic infrastructures. Country in Africa and South America that wants to be part of this great effort in genomic research and want to be able to benefit from genomic. It's important that some organization can be there to advise them, to help them decide what they want to do in their country about genetic discrimination and the kind of protection that's right for them. So I created this Genetic Discrimination Observatory, and I'm proud to say it has grown quite significantly since I launched it internationally in 2020. You see all the countries where we have researchers right now. I take this opportunity to thank Ted Duff and to thank Jane as well, which are part of this observatory. It's really great to see the dedication of so many people from so many countries to participate to the observatory, and so many disciplines as well. It's really interdisciplinary in the way that it functions. Things that we do information maps. You saw the policy map that I've shown you. We have a similar map that shows all the studies that have been done on genetic discrimination. If you're interested in documenting the incidence of this problem, all those studies are available. We have a Share Your Story tool, and I'll go on this one a little bit more in a second. And we have several means of doing knowledge dissemination. We have a great website which you can check out. Just type Genetic Discrimination Observatory, and you'll see all the features that we have. So this Share Your Story is a really interesting tool that we've developed. Basically what it does is it allows for people to actually, that have been victim of genetic discrimination, to actually tell their story in their own word so that it is documented. We use it really a little bit as a way to see where new types of discrimination are emerging. It's not a statistical tool for us. And of course, the information is confidential and we don't keep any nominative part of that information. It's just to help us see where new cases of discrimination emerge, like a barometer a little bit. Right now, it's open for people in Canada, in US, in UK, and in Mexico that are victim of genetic discrimination. So if you know somebody around you that has a story, please tell them that they can let us know about it confidentially, and this way that their story will be accounted for. This is just to show you that we've been extremely busy in 2021, 2022. I won't go into the detail, time is flying, and so I just wanted you to see a little bit, and I'll be happy to discuss some of these things in greater detail. You see that we've been quite involved with international organizations, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, for example. We've developed an information tool called JEDI, which allows people to know a little bit more about genetic discrimination in a language that is really harmonized. So if you're going to do international research as a scientist and you want to know what are the challenges with genetic discrimination, what should I tell participants, etc., this is a really good tool to start. Of course, you'll have to contextualize it to your own country, but really great place to start. It's the only tool like this that is harmonized, really. And you can see that we've done quite a bit of research on developing a good non-genetic discrimination policies through a Delphi survey. This is not completed yet. We're at round 2 of this survey, which is a 3-round policy survey. We've developed a case study at the demand of the World Health Organization. It's in press right now. We're hoping it'll be released soon, that case study, so that it could be used as well. And we're always on the lookout for new innovative ideas of how we can address and prevent genetic discrimination. So any thoughts that people want to share with me is really greatly welcome. We've published 2 papers as a group so far, one in Trends in Genetics. The first one was in Nature Genetics, actually. I don't think I have that first one here. So that was really, if you're interested in the story of how the International Genetic Discrimination Observatory was created and what are the main principles behind this observatory, this would be the publication to look for. And the second publication in Trends in Genetics, if you want to know where new types of genetic discrimination are emerging, if you really want to have the right time of the day into what are the new areas where we should be concerned, what are the most recent developments, this is the paper that you want to be looking at. And those are the main things really that I wanted to discuss. We're always interested in expanding our scope. As you saw, we are already active in, I think we're at 26 jurisdictions, close to that. We like to expand our reach, especially to developing countries, but any country that is not yet represented, we're always also interested in collaborating with researchers from a variety of disciplines that are interested in doing research and prevention work regarding genetic discrimination. This picture was taken at our last hybrid meeting, and not everyone that was here could be represented on the picture. As I've mentioned, this is really growing. And I just want to thank all of the people that have been helping me, without whom I wouldn't have been able to pull this together. And that was it for me. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to address any questions that anyone might have.
Many thanks indeed, Jan. Excellent presentation. We have a good amount of time for questions and comments, either from those of you tuning in virtually from around the world or those here in Vienna. So please just, there's 2 microphones I see in the center of the room. Please just come up and pose your question, and I might ask a few questions along the way too. Yes, please. And maybe introduce yourself too before you pose the question.
Hi, Jan. I'm Melissa Martin from the Melbourne Genomics Health Alliance in Australia. I was really interested in the toolkit you mentioned for using to talk to people about genetic discrimination through international data sharing. And I wondered whether it distinguishes between international data sharing for research purposes or for clinical purposes, and whether there are differences in the experiences and also consequences for research data sharing and clinical data sharing internationally.
Right. Well, I'm sure there are really fine distinction between the two, for sure. I would say that most international collaboration right now are at the research level, although there's a growing number of collaboration that are starting to happen also in the context of clinical genetics. And we can think, for example, about the BRCA exchange, etc. I would say the risk of genetic discrimination is probably higher when you're in a clinical context, definitely. As I mentioned, the tool is made to be really accessible and simple, but it needs to be contextualized to your country and to your specific context. That's the trade-off. And of course, one next step we could think about is to probably take this tool and say, okay, can we do a version for different countries and for different domains of genetics? Would that be something we're developing? And so maybe that would be an interesting idea to pursue.
Ainsley, please.
Hi, thank you. Ainsley Newson from the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you for that fantastic presentation. It's wonderful to hear everything that you've established, especially during a pandemic. I'm wondering, as a consortium, how you are addressing the question of genetic exceptionalism. And I think this is going to become particularly important when we start to think about some of those emerging forms of the use of genetics and genomics that you've alluded to, like PRS, epigenetics. Because I think sometimes we have to remember that we need to see this in context with other kinds of health data and clinical testing, etc. So yeah, how are you addressing that in your consortium?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's a fantastic question. The downside is, as you can imagine, I'm not going to resolve the question of genetic exceptionalism today, but one great way of functioning, which we found, which I'm very happy with the Genetic Discrimination Observatory, is we found a way to accommodate, I would say, both trends of thought in terms of having some people who actually fairly believe that genetic information is exceptional and deserve exceptional treatment, but also people that believe that there are other types of omics information, for example, or biomarkers that also justify protection. I tend to be more on that side of the spectrum personally. I think you really ought to, these are things you really need to consider very seriously. Now, do we need to take a position on one end or the other of the spectrum? Not necessarily. I think that as soon as you can agree that genetic information might not be unique, but might raise sufficiently significant issues that, it needs to be addressed. Now, the debate which remains open is, how far do we go in unpacking that genetic discrimination? Do we include those other omics type of information? Do we include other types of predictive health data? That's where it sort of get really tricky. And we know about family history of disease as well, which insurers like to ask about. Are we including data as well? So, great question.
Thanks, Ainsley. I might take the chair's prerogative to ask a question. Yeah, and I noticed in one of your slides there was a statement that genetic discrimination is not widespread, and that there seems to be a kind of gap between a perceived fear and concern about discrimination from a test result and reality. Why do you think that gap exists? Clearly, there is prevalence in cases of genetic discrimination, but there's also a sense based on empirical research that is not as widespread as one might anticipate. So why do you think this gap exists and persists?
Yeah, I think it's so there's two parts to answer this. The first part is the evidence part. Why is the evidence not so great? It's really difficult to document discrimination, not just genetic discrimination, but discrimination in general, because it's so, in a way, tortuous discrimination, because you can be discriminated against without even realizing you've been discriminated. And so, if you're asking for people to report that they've been discriminated because of genetic characteristic or result, you might both get a problem of over-reporting, where people feel they've been discriminated for that very reason, but actually haven't. They've been, for example, refused insurance because of a pre-existing condition. But you can have also under-reporting, where people have actually been excluded from a job or from an insurance, obtaining insurance, and they didn't really ask why. They assumed that it was for another reason, when in fact it was because of a genetic result. So it's really, and the other, it's difficult as well from a perspective of just developing a study, asking the right questions. You saw how complex the definition of genetic discrimination was. So that's the part about the evidence. Now, why are people concerned so much about this? I think that's one of the issues when we talk about genetic exceptionalism, actually. One of the problems is that there's been so much discussion about genetic discrimination. There's been so much discussion about, the problems created by genetics, that for a lot of people, it's challenging to have a sense of proportion and to sort of say, yes, there is this risk of genetic discrimination, but unless I've tested positive for monogenic, highly penetrant disorder, it's quite unlikely that this will be used to prevent, me obtaining a job or an insurance. It's difficult to get that sense for people. So that's the part about why are people sort of not aware, and also not aware necessarily of existing protection, because it's just the information's not there in a format they can digest.
If I could ask as well about some of the recent activities of the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. You mentioned this Share Your Story tool. I'm wondering if there's any feedback yet from participants and a sense of the power of narrative. So not a survey or an interview per se, but just the ability to share their story. What's the feedback been like, if any participants have shared their story yet? And also maybe if there's time to inform us a bit more about the Delphi survey that you're running and how the survey results can feed into what's called an optimal non-genetic discrimination policy, and what sort of issues that might entail.
Sure. So about the Share Our Story feature, because we don't keep any nominative information, we don't recontact people that have submitted information. So we have not been able to have feedback. It's a trade-off. The reason for that is we wanted this to be really convenient. We didn't want to have to seek ethics authorization from every country and have to come up with a very stringent protocol. We just wanted it to be easy for people that had a problem to tell us about the problem, basically. So as I said, the trade-off is we can recontact them. As I mentioned, the way that it's been useful for us has been to really indicate to us new ways that discrimination could happen. So for example, a story that I've been told in the Share a Story feature had to do with a person that had done some pharmacogenomic test, and the result indicated that she was at a higher likelihood, and I forgot which polymorphism this is, but of having adverse reaction to art conditions. So she basically learned about that when that person went to see her physician, or she changed physician as her family physician had retired, went to see a new physician. He basically asked her to sign a waiver saying that she had that particular condition and that he was taking no responsibility if she decided not to follow the pharmacogenomic guidelines. And so I had no idea this kind of thing was happening out there. And thanks to that person, it's now on the radar. So that's how I see this as a very useful tool. Regarding the Delphi study that we're doing, the idea there is it's really difficult for policymakers to address genetic discrimination. Law is a really cumbersome instrument, and when you try to legislate, and that's what lawyers like to do, there's a problem, and even ethicists are very normative sometimes. You have a problem and you want to adopt a law, you want to prevent this, you want to do this and that. But the problem is science is in constant evolution, and when we started to adopt these non-genetic discrimination law 20 years ago and more, there was no risk prediction models out there. Epigenetics was not born yet. So the laws and their definition are stuck in a period of time that really is not that useful for today's genetic. So the idea behind this survey of experts is to develop a law that's going to have sufficient flexibility and foresight that it can stand the test of time. And once we have that model law with those different clauses, we can then help countries that have not yet developed law or that want to modify their legal instrument by proposing a model that we think is more suitable and adaptable.
Thanks, Jan. Yes, please introduce yourself and please pose your question.
Good morning, Professor. Francesco Florindi from Thermo Fisher Scientific. I absolutely agree with you. Normally, law it's pretty slower than science in picking up and changing. For a change, I think we might have an opportunity in Europe with the European Health Data Space regulation you might be aware of, and other regulation, a new AI legal framework for Europe that I think indirectly can have a huge impact on genetic discrimination. It sounds to me that your Delphi study cannot come soon enough to inform the European policymakers. What would you like to see in this new large scope data sharing frameworks that we're putting together in Europe?
Thank you. So I think it needs flexibility. A good framework needs flexibility because, and when you talk about the new laws on AI, and I think about the GDPR in my mind, and now it's done a lot of great things, but it's also done it's raised new challenge for people that are trying to do large-scale genomics and international genomics, because first of all, it's extremely complex. There's a lot of uncertainties out there about different part of the law and how they would play out, etc. So we have to be really careful when we adopt a legal instrument, especially, for example, on a broad topic like privacy, that we have considered, the different application that this might have, because if you're sort of cutting too broad, you're gonna prevent, like, as I mentioned, some kind of selection using genetic or some kind of communication of genetic information that could be very positive. So I would say flexibility is key. And one interesting feature that I've seen in some instrument is the possibility by national decree that you would issue a decree on a, for example, yearly basis to actually determine, for example, which areas would be prohibited. For example, insurance, for example, employment. So you would determine those fields on a yearly basis. You'd have an authority that is fairly impartial in the debate. So it could be a privacy, for example, authority in a country that would determine on a yearly basis where information can be communicated or not. That could be an idea, for example.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you. Perfect time for one last question. Melissa, please.
Hi, Melissa Klein, UC Santa Cruz, and well, I have a question that follows on the previous question, and that is, given that, well, given this challenge that people don't necessarily understand the genetic protections available to them, and given that law is complex and geographically varied and science is evolving, what do you think are good ways to disseminate this knowledge into the patient communities?
I think more proactive engagement of participant and patient is needed, and I think it needs to be done also by doctors, by researchers, so they must have the kind of material within reach that they can use to communicate. And I don't see a lot of that going on, and it's kind of sad because, again, when there's a problem, the first thing that comes to mind of ethicists and lawyers is really, let's legislate, let's do this. And then you legislate, but then you forget to go ahead with an information campaign at the same time, and you end up with a law that nobody really knows how to use or even exist. So that's something that we need to replace with a model of really co-creation from the beginning and really active engagement where doctors and research geneticists see it as part of their work to engage with the community they're going to be working with on some of these issues. And again, the idea is to develop some really easy tool that they'll be able to use to do that. They're busy people, I completely get that. They don't want to spend, hours and hours on their time on ethical issues when they have science to do. So it's a trade-off where that material needs to be made available to them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. We've had a question come in from the online viewers, maybe a quick response to this one. There's a question raised from Elena Lopez about what legislation will do for DTC results. Do you think there's a necessity for a law for DTC consumer testing and otherwise, or not?
Well, that's a great last question, isn't it?
A very brief response.
Okay, my God. The problem is, let's be realistic again. When you're talking about direct-to-consumer genetic testing, you're talking about companies that are out there operating on the internet, and this is an area that's so difficult to capture by law. So I think we have to do this step by step. I think first we need to sort of, and I really, this is from, my own personal research and feeling. I've done a bit of research on the matter, but I think more studies are definitely going to need to be made in that area. But I think that what would be important is, as I said, a progressive mechanism where at first you force the industry to self-regulate. And you can do that by basically pressuring them and threatening legal action, et cetera, or threatening to regulate. So once they've self-regulated the practice, we can start assessing whether they follow their own norms, whether their own norms are sufficiently rigorous. And then comes the next step of the process where you can think about regulating parts that aren't working. But I think that there's a lot of, again, work on, and another important part of that puzzle is the education of the customer. You really need to, people can limit the risk that they're going to be discriminated or their privacy is going to be violated. There's a lot of little things that people can do before they purchase a genetic test to see, is the company legit? Is the contractual agreement that I'm signing, is the consent appropriate? Are they going to take my information and share it with whomever they'd like and keep it forever? Or is it actually really well defined where the information is going to be used and for how long, et cetera? So things like that are also super important.
Thank you very much, John. Perfect timing. Thank you again very much for your presentation this morning. Thanks, yeah.